So what we're going to do is I'm going to begin by setting you a quiz. We're going to have a little quiz. I'm going to share the screen, and I'd like you all in this shared screen to just write down your answers. The ADHD quick quiz. There's about 12 questions or 13 questions that I wrote on this. The answers are yes, no, or maybe. Okay. So I'm going to ask the questions. I'm going to ask you to write down the answers, and then I'm going to give you the answers. Okay. So it's not going to be totting up your scores at the end. First question. ADHD is a medical disorder. Yes, no, or maybe. So write down what you think. And the answer is maybe. So the reason I put maybe is that, yes, it is medical. It is a medical condition. And actually one of the people, or one of the groups of people who are able to diagnose, and I use that word very, very specifically, one of the groups of people who are able to diagnose ADHD are doctors. But then, is it a disorder? So that this language of disorder is, again, which is why, yes, it's medical, but is it a disorder? We don't know that. That's something which is a political decision for ourselves. Next question. ADHD only affects boys. Yes, no, or maybe. Oopsie daisy. You might have seen the answer. No, it affects girls and boys, although there is some evidence to suggest that more boys are affected than girls. There's also some evidence to suggest that different types of ADHD affect boys and girls differently, that we will come to later. ADHD is the result of bad parenting. Yeah, I'm not even gonna give you any suspense on that. Clearly it's not. Next one. ADHD is the result of poor diet. Maybe, but probably not. What we know is it's probably not the result of poor diet, but we know that dietary intervention can mitigate some of the problems of ADHD. So it's this word result. So it's the result of poor diet. Not really, no, but poor diet can contribute. Giving ADHD children special accommodations is unfair on other children. That's a political question if ever there was one. Of course it isn't. Of course it isn't. In fact, it's unfair not to. It's unfair not to. Children who take ADHD medication are likely to become drug abusers in later life. Yes, no, or maybe. The answer is no, they're not. And actually, there is some really interesting research to suggest that children with ADHD who do not take drugs, things like Ritalin and adrenaline and effectively forms of stimulants. Methamphetamine apparently is something that used to be used. There is evidence to suggest that children who don't take medication for ADHD are more likely to become drug abusers in later life because they start to feel the need for the drugs. So if you can control ADHD, I'm not a big fan of using drugs on any child to sort of dampen who they are, but sometimes it can be of help. Sometimes it can be of help, especially when the child is being diagnosed medically. Children with ADHD are stupid or lazy. Well, they might be, but not because of their ADHD. Children with ADHD are often annoying. Probably yes. And I say that very sincerely, that we have to be very authentic with ourselves. We have to be honest with ourselves. We can't pretend that certain things aren't difficult for us. That when we come across a child with ADHD, a hyperactive child, as we used to call them when I was when I was young, we can't pretend it's not a problem. Sometimes it can be annoying. So if we own that, then we can start to deal with our own responses to people with ADHD. ADHD and ADD are the same thing. That is, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and attention deficit disorder are the same thing. No, they're not. They are linked, but they are not exactly the same thing, and we will come to the differences in a second. More girls have ADD than boys. Yes. You are more likely to come across a girl with attention deficit disorder than a boy with attention deficit disorder. And we'll see how it manifests itself soon. Okay. Manifestations of ADD include zoning out. Yes. One of the most common manifestations of attention deficit disorder is the opposite of what a lot of people associate with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So with ADHD, people find that the child is always moving, throwing chairs sometimes, or running around or shouting. ADD, attention deficit disorder, can be the opposite, and it can involve zoning out, introverting rather than extroverting. The effects of ADHD can be softened with good diet. We've dealt with that, and the answer is yes. A lot of medics say that yes, it can be softened with good diet. And we'll have a look at the kinds of diets that we can use. ADHD children can hyperfocus. Yeah, absolutely they can. Well done, well done, well done, well done. You have finally succeeded in completing the ADHD online quiz. Let's have a look at some of the answers we've got. I think you've, yeah, absolutely, yeah. Brilliant. Okay, so what we're going to do is, I've introduced the idea of ADHD and ADD, the idea of hyperfocus, the idea of zoning out, the idea of the difference between girls and boys. It's very interesting that we introduced this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the 7 types of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder that have been identified, or at the very least the 7 types that are relevant for our purposes. And they each manifest themselves differently. Now, this isn't simply me showing you the 7 types. This is an activity for you. Right, this is an activity for you. So what I'm going to do is I am going to show you the 7 types of ADHD. I've got a security scan that's coming up on my computer. I'm going to show you the 7 types of ADHD. And what I'd like you to do is, as I go through these, I want you to think about some of the children that you might deal with, or some of the people that you know in your life. And I want you to write the names down of anybody that you think might actually correspond to these descriptions. So what we're now doing is we're now focusing our attention. Do we actually know anybody with ADHD? Right. Share the screen again. Back onto the share. Okay, there we go, right. These are the 7 types of ADHD. Dr. Arman's 7 types of ADHD. There is what we call classic, inattentive, overfocused, temporal lobe, limbic, anxious, and ring of fire. What I'm going to do is I am going to split them into 3 categories. The first category is the common category. That includes classic, inattentive, and overfocused. These are the most likely that you will come across. The second category is what you might call the slightly less common, but the neurologically defined category. That is the temporal lobe and the limbic. And the final category is what we might describe as emotional ADHD. Anxious and ring of fire. I love that phrase, ring of fire ADHD, brilliant. So we're going to go through each one of them. As I go through them, please, please, please make a note of the names of anybody who manifests any of these. So we're going to begin with classic. Signs of classic ADHD include inattentive, being inattentive. So you speak and then they stop listening to you. They are distracted, and that's closely linked with this inattentivity. They might be hyperactive, which is linked with the distraction. Disorganized, linked with the hyperactivity. And impulsive, linked with the disorganization. And then, of course, the impulsive leads to inattentivity. And so there is a cycle going on with this type of ADHD. People who are inattentive, distracted, hyperactive, disorganized, and impulsive. People who strongly manifest this. Please note down the names of anybody you know. The second type is the inattentivity, the inattentive type of ADHD. These people manifest a short attention span. They are very distractible. They're easily distracted. They are disorganized, so it's very similar to the classic. They can often procrastinate. That is, they put things off until a later date. This is because they actually have what's the phrase for it? Executive functioning problems. So they can procrastinate. They put things off to a later date. They can be introverted, and they will daydream a lot. Now, I know a couple of people who clearly manifest this inattentive form of ADHD, or ADD more likely. Short attention span, distractible, disorganized, procrastinating, introverted, daydreaming. You'll notice this is not hyperactive here. So keep on with the names. The third type of ADHD is what we call the overfocused ADHD. These people have difficulty shifting attention. So often when they're doing tasks, they focus on one aspect of this task and find it difficult moving from that aspect to another aspect. It's another manifestation of what we call executive functioning problems. They often have negative thought patterns. They see the world negatively. They see themselves negatively. And this is compounded by a hyper focus. They really, really focus, which is the core of this overfocused ADHD. They have difficulty shifting attention, and this comes out in inflexibility in performing tasks. And often this inflexibility can make them look stubborn. So if you know people who are hyper-focused, negative, and stubborn, it could actually be a manifestation of one of the 7 types of ADHD. The temporal lobe, ADHD. There's so much science we can go into with this, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to show you the manifestations. Poor memory. There is a very poor memory, and this is because of the temporal lobe involvement here. There are mood swings, vast mood swings, from happy to sad to angry to aggressive to frightened. This accompanies mild paranoia, often thinking that people hate them, or people have got it in for them, or somebody is bullying them when they're not being bullied. And this can often manifest itself as anger. Now, I know of one child in particular who genuinely believed that there was a girl who was bullying him, and he would become really angry and he would fight her. And this girl wasn't bullying her, wasn't bullying him, but this boy thought that she was. Because of the poor memory, there is a difficulty in taking in information. So if we simply feed these children facts, they will have problems taking in and processing that. And they have visual processing difficulties. They might not be able to see the difference between one thing and another, but they might not be able to see spaces as the same size between things. Visual processing difficulties. One of the visual processing difficulties there may be, as I've said earlier on, is Irlen syndrome. I showed you that optical illusion at the beginning, where there are things that are still, but it looks like they're moving. This is a visual processing difficulty. Irlen syndrome and this type of ADHD can overlap. Think of anybody you know who manifests these. The next type of ADHD is the limbic type of ADHD. This is quite the limbic part of the brain effectively is the emotional part of the brain, put in extraordinarily simplistic terms. And you'll find that people with limbic ADHD will often be very sad. They'll be melancholy. They will be moody. They will have moodiness, low energy, feelings of helplessness, feelings of guilt and low self-esteem. It's actually very easy to confuse this for depression. And, you know, in a way it is depression. Feelings of helplessness, of guilt that you've done something wrong, of low energy, moodiness, low self-esteem, it all goes together. And if you know any children like that, or if you know anybody like that, start thinking in terms of ADHD. The final category of ADHD, the emotional category, we now get to the anxious ADHD. Anxiety breeds headaches and physical symptoms such as stomach aches, physical stress, muscle aches, back aches, that sort of thing. Obviously, anxiety, panic attacks, predicting the worst, having a negative outlook on life. Challenging others to judge them. What I mean is performing actions that are almost self-fulfilling prophecies. A lot of children with ADHD of this particular type, the anxious type of ADHD, will perform actions, will do things that challenge others to look upon them negatively. And this almost justifies the anxiety that they have. And in tense situations, they freeze. The reactions we have is fight, flight, or freeze. They often freeze. So it's not the fight reaction that a lot of people with ADHD have, it's the freeze reaction. And this is the first of the two emotional forms of ADHD: headaches and stomach aches and back aches and muscle aches and joint aches. Anxiety, predicting the worst, challenging others to judge them, and freezing in tense situations. Do you know anyone who's like that? And finally, this ring of fire ADHD. This involves a hypersensitivity to sensory stimulation, and it can often therefore be confused for ASD, autism. It will show, because of this hypersensitivity, oppositional behavior. People are fighting the environment around them. They will be subject to mood swings, up and down, up and down. They will talk quickly, they will worry a lot, and they will obsess about things. And it's almost like, if you think about the anxiety form of ADHD, it's almost like an introversion of the negative emotions. The ring of fire ADHD is an extroversion of the negative emotions. Now, these are the 7 distinct types that people have identified of ADHD. I hope as we were going through those, what you managed to do is you managed to note down anybody you know who manifests any of these. The way of dealing with ADHD is remarkably similar for each of the 7 types. So the 7 types, knowing them allows you to identify it, or allows you to become what we're calling in the Central Toolkit a detectologist. But you don't have to, in fact, you shouldn't be the person to think about diagnosing or diagnosing or treating with drugs. That's not our job. But our job is to create an environment which mitigates some of the negatives and allows some of the positives to come out. So in terms of mitigating some of the negatives, we have to campaign that whatever food there is that these children are given, that any child is given, is a balanced diet that involves a good balance of vitamins, a good balance of oils, a good balance of essential fatty acids, good balance of minerals, iron, zinc, these things. So if we can ensure that, for instance, if a school gives out food, that the school's diet is balanced, lots of greens, lots of beans, lots of legumes, these things, then these things can go towards, they won't do it on their own, but they can go towards mitigating some of the negative effects of ADHD. The second thing we can do with ADHD is make sure that whatever we do, we make it short and active. So with ADHD, what we're trying to do is we're trying to create tasks that don't demand long attention spans, although some people will have long attention spans, that segment the tasks into easily identifiable portions, and that there is something to do in each of these identifiable portions. And then if some of the ADHD kids, some of the kids who for instance, they hyper-focus and they introvert, maybe they can just stick on one of these portions. But we make our, the third part is we make our instructions absolutely 100% clear and concise. We guide using instructions. So most of the time teachers do this anyway, but instruction has to be clear, concise, and guided. Tasks have to be segmented into clear sections, and there has to be an activity within each task. You know, the opposite of that is just expecting kids to sit down from the moment the bell rings at 8 o'clock in the morning to the moment it rings at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and just write and read. That's not appropriate for anybody with ADHD. It's not appropriate for anyone with dyslexia either. And in fact, it's not appropriate for anyone on the autism spectrum. These traditional forms of teaching. So it's task-based teaching. The tasks are segmented into chunks. Each chunk has an activity that is clear and that is laid out. We lay out and we distinguish and we differentiate tasks and activities using physical, multisensory, colorful instructions and activities. If we make the colors friendly and we make the activities soft activities, then physical, multisensory, and visual things are actually suitable for people with dyslexia, autism, and ADHD. And so if we think about clear instructions, segmenting things, making things very easily guidable, but each thing is an activity, and the activity involves something that's multisensory, and the instructions can be given in colors, and you can have a timer. So green is there's lots of time, orange there's not much time, red there's not much time left at all. If you can lay out time segments in these ways so that everyone can see what's happening, then you're actually reaching people with all of those three different neurodiversities. Now, I know that this is a very, very light, surface, superficial look at dyslexia, autism, and ADHD, but I hope that by the end of it, you've got some ideas of who you're dealing with, what it is you're dealing, and the types of things you might want to look at. It's about 20 past, a little bit after 20 past. I'd like it if anybody could ask any questions that you have, and we'll deal with them. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that.